is not the way of the jetpack!
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, it was actually rewarding to be a Star Wars fan, and no better proof of that comes from the plethora of quality video games we got back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Most of which were on the PC, with things like the awesome X-Wing vs TIE Fighter series, along with LucasArts and Raven Software's Dark Forces and Jedi Knight games. The latter being one of the earliest examples of what was commonly referred to as a Doom clone, which was a pretty broad term really just used to describe any first-person shooter that wasn't Doom. Now, Dark Forces originally came out in 1995, and it really was a bit of a technical breakthrough for the time, adding in lots of new features and mechanics to the genre which really hadn't been done yet. For instance, it was one of the first shooters to ever let you jump and crouch, along with the engine allowing for more advanced architecture, including things like having rooms above other rooms, which is something that eluded even Doom at the time. This allowed for more elaborate and complex layouts with the kind of level design that reminds us yet again that workplace safety is practically non-existent in the Star Wars universe.
I says, forget the dental plan, forget sick leave, I just want a railing. You know, one railing, right here.
To be honest though, that probably was by design, considering the whole thing was just rife with references to that original trilogy of films. Like all those familiar looking droids you put out of commission, the charred corpses during that one mission, which more or less look exactly like the suntan treatment that Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru received, through to a couple of environments that look exactly the same as Leia's ship from the beginning of A New Hope. Just one of the earliest games I can remember playing that felt like it was an extension of the universe it was based off, back to when that kind of thing just wasn't as commonplace.
Very impressive, General.
And I just don't think people these days really understand either just how much LucasArts was on top of their game back then. Between the Monkey Island and the Indiana Jones games, Full Throttle and Day of the Tentacle, they really were playing a big part in the evolution of storytelling for the industry. And as a result of that too, Dark Forces was really one of the earliest FPS games to actually have a detailed story and plot, with short cutscenes often in between each mission, along with pre-rendered cinematics and full voice acting for the various characters.
I understand the threat, Lord Vader.
Really being one of the first games to do it, beating even William Shatner's Tech War to the punch.
If you're not bringing in the bad guys, you may as well be staking out the donut shop.
The story is you're playing as a mercenary named Kyle Katarn, working with the Rebel Alliance during their early days, fighting back against the Empire, carrying out top secret missions under Cloak and Dagger, and being a real pain in the ass for the Imperial's plans. The opening mission even has you stealing the plans for the original Death Star.
This is too easy.
Yeah, the very same plans that would lead Luke to blowing it up in the fourth film. You'd often have to traverse deep into enemy territory, exploring these complex facilities and bases, along with carrying out all your main objectives, before then hightailing it back to an extraction zone for pickup.
Kyle, where are you? I'm back at the landing pad.
Utilising crucial items you'd find along the way too, like night vision goggles so you could see in the dark. You had snow boots so you could easily walk across ice, and even a gas mask to help you get through toxic fumes. Plus, it might be one of the first FPSs to ever let you carry around a flashlight as well. The eventual plot you uncovered was centered around the Empire creating the Dark Troopers, a super powerful elite unit which, funnily enough, also got re-added back into the Star Wars canon recently, which in some ways makes Dark Forces' plot still relevant and those missions interesting to play through.
You better get me out of here.
So, no matter how you look at it, the whole thing really broke new ground.
It broke new ground!
And it was the first real FPS we ever had for the Star Wars series. Whilst it might not be any kind of timeless masterpiece, it's still hard to ignore the influence it had as well. And those follow-up titles like Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy would have never been able to fly if Dark Forces didn't walk to begin with. Which makes it even more crazy to think that it's about to turn 30 years old, making it ripe, I guess, for the remaster treatment, which is exactly what Night Dive Studios have gone and done, yet again, reviving a decades-old game and just really making the whole thing seem effortless. And if this is the first time you played Dark Forces since the 1990s, or more than that, your first time at all, well, then it's never been easier to hop into Kyle's boots and get to blasting stormtroopers.
I should have kept working for the Empire.
Where it matters most, this remaster pretty much achieves all it sets out to do. That being, allowing the game to run at a high resolution and frame rate, up to 4K and 120 FPS. The remaster also includes the option for playing with the gamepad as well, which is useful for bus, train, or air travel, along with those highly crucial moments where you need to take time out of your daily schedule to drop a fat shit. People who haven't played Dark Forces before might not appreciate this fully, but the first thing I immediately noticed when I started playing is just how much clearer the overall image looks, to the point now that you can even see all those little indents on Kyle's blaster. The reason for this is that all of the sprite work and the textures across the board have been completely overhauled, and I'm told by Night Dive that this has all been done by hand, not a single use of AI anywhere in the building, which is a good thing. The cinematics have all been completely updated as well, with all of the hand-drawn stuff kind of looking out of place in comparison to just how much more detailed that pre-rendered stuff is.
Very perceptive, Commander.
About the only thing I noticed is that the music still sounds like a bit of a jumbled mess, like the notes often seem to run into each other, but then again, considering that that was also a big part of the original soundtrack, well, it's at least keeping the whole thing faithful. Either way though, presentation-wise, all of this stuff has been updated seamlessly without it ever feeling like it's straying away from that overall aesthetic and look. And it's kind of funny too, because like playing the remaster is like what your brain remembers that original game looked like. Then it's only when you go back and actually load the original thing up and play through it properly that you realize just how different it actually was. And it's definitely one of those instances where it's just kind of staggering when you compare the remaster to the original.
This contemptible excuse for an officer will no longer divulge any more information to that rebel, Kyle Katarn.
Katarn will not be as easy to deal with. He is very resourceful.
That was beautiful.
I mean, even when I first started playing through the remaster, I didn't really notice this, but then I went back and loaded up that original DOS version in all its low-resolution glory, and I started to really understand just how much work's gone into updating those tired old visuals. If, however, for some reason you don't want to play through the remaster with these updated visuals, well, you do have the option to toggle that on or off in the options menu, which is a nice touch. And I get it, I mean, there is a lot of value and charm in playing an older looking game at a high resolution. But overall, everything seems to work the way it's intended, which is all that really matters. I didn't have any serious bugs or glitches. In fact, I don't think I had any single bugs at all.
Impressive.
But even on the off chance that you get stuck in a wall or some other piece of geometry, there's an option to respawn in the menu which can get you out of a jam. Literally.
Most impressive.
The game crashed a grand total of 1 time in the 5 hours I spent playing through it, and even then, like, that seemed to be the fault of the Steam overlay more than the game itself. Because I do admit, I was shift-tabbed at the time and was trying to buy Taylor Swift tickets online, which was probably the reason for my downfall, more ways than one.
Good.
This remaster also comes with all the assorted bonus and side content you'd expect as well, that being a whole heap of behind-the-scenes artwork and photos. There's even a playable version of an old Dark Forces demo, which is kind of interesting, I guess, just to see how far things have progressed throughout the years. But I'll leave it to Digital Foundry to go through this thing with their fine-tooth comb and cover all the ins and outs. Because where it matters most, the remaster seems to be pretty much flawless. So yeah, dog, if you're hoping for a faithful, easily accessible way to play through Dark Forces, well then be happy in the knowledge that that's what you're getting. I mean, this ain't Kingpin Reloaded, let's just put it that way. And if that's all you wanted to know, well, then you could probably just stop watching right now and, go pick this thing up. Thanks for watching. But if you want to stick around a little bit longer, well, let me tell you what kind of game you're actually going to be playing.
Certainly, Lord Vader.
Right, so I said earlier that Dark Forces is often referred to as a Doom clone, and on a basic level, that's not the worst way to describe it. If you played any shooter in recent years, even so much as dipping your toes into that wave of boomer shooters that have flooded the internet, well, then the controls here are going to feel instantly accessible. It's also a pretty accurate comparison in the sense that this is again a 2.5D first-person shooter, where you move around with the mouse and keyboard and shoot more or less everything that moves with a variety of weapons. starting weapon is Kyle's blaster, which is more or less just like a pistol, and like all FPS pistols from the 90s, is about as effective as harsh language. Thankfully, it's replaced within literally the first 10 seconds of the game with the Stormtrooper rifle. The infamously inaccurate weapon of choice for all of the peripherally vision challenged grunts of the Imperial Army. Fuck, that was a mouthful, man. Now, this is more or less what you're going to be using for 90% of the game, simply because ammo is more abundant than photos of your mum with her clothes off. Not to mention, it has a decent firing rate and does a nice amount of damage. In lieu of a rocket launcher, you've got the thermal detonators and the mortar.
You're in violation.
Both of which are pretty fun to use and good at wiping out small groups of enemies. And considering too that the only other time we'd ever really seen a thermal detonator before this was back when Leia pulled one out in Return of the Jedi.
Because he's holding a thermal detonator.
It was a pretty neat inclusion to have them as a weapon, and is just one of the many ways where Dark Forces paid homage to its source material. For pretty much every other weapon in the game, though, is where it starts to tread new ground, and show off a bit more creativity and originality, even if some of these are kinda lacking. Now, for 3 of the other weapons, they all use the same power cells as a shared ammo type, and that's the repeater, the fusion cutter, and then the concussion rifle. The repeater is more or less just like a stronger, more powerful and accurate version of the Stormtrooper rifle. The fusion cutter fires out slower moving projectiles, which more or less seem to do the same amount of damage as the repeater. And then the concussion rifle drops like a shockwave on a targeted area, dealing out loads of damage, but having a slight delay before firing, plus it also seems to have trouble hitting things above or below the player. Which really just kind of makes it somewhat less effective. So I feel like overall, I used this one the least out of every other weapon, and most of the time I just stuck with the Stormtrooper rifle, the repeater, and the thermal detonators. I mean, they ain't much, but it's honest work. Then for the final couple of weapons, you've got the mortar launcher and the plasma cannon, with the latter being the most useful by far, having a missile launcher as its alternate fire and also being the weapon of choice for the Dark Troopers. But the real running theme with all of these is that they're all just some form of projectile weapon, and with the exception of that thermal detonator and the mortar, they seem to kill every enemy in the same amount of time, give or take. Which means that a lot of the time I'm not really choosing a weapon based off what it does, more so I'm just choosing a weapon based off how much ammo I've got available. And regardless of which weapon you're using, the shooting doesn't really change from just holding down the left mouse button until everything's dead. It's not really helping either that the variety of enemy types in Dark Forces is severely lacking. I mean, if you're not shooting the same looking Stormtroopers or Imperial officers over and over, then it's the same 2 or 3 versions of Guard and Variety Bounty Hunters. And because that rogue gallery of alien species was so low for Star Wars back in the 1990s, then that means it's really just the same few types over and over. I mean, you got those pig guys from Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi, the Grand, which are those 3-eyed guys you saw for all of 3 seconds when Luke was fighting the Rancor, again in Return of the Jedi. And then finally, Bosk. Yeah, one of the bounty hunters hired by Vader to track down the Millennium Falcon. And a character too who is just such an underrated badass. The only real other enemy type you come up against are the various forms of the Dark Troopers, both of which are pretty easy to deal with, you know, as long as you know how to strafe left and right. And you never really fight enough of these guys at once that it ever truly becomes challenging. All up, it's a simple enough combat system, but yeah, it definitely lacks that variety of other shooters from the time, namely Doom. What is kind of interesting though is that Dark Forces does away with the whole save-based approach and instead gives you limited lives, beginning each mission with 3 and respawning you nearby when you're killed.
Major fracture detected.
And what's most likely to kill the player, I think, is any of the dozen explosive mines that the level designers have often hid in the worst possible places. And it's kind of funny to think how many Stormtroopers and Bounty Hunters Kyle's going to kill here, only to be done in by an explosive mine placed in the corner of a room. Anyway, when all those lives are used up, you're thrown back to the main menu and forced to start from the beginning of the current mission, which, yeah, does sound like a bit of a pain in the ass, but it genuinely really isn't that bad. Only with the exception of a couple of missions which are absolutely fucking awful. Like the one escaping from Jabba's ship, which has you fighting space dragons with your bare hands.
Yes!
Not to mention what might be one of the most awful sewer missions ever made, which also happens to be the third mission in the game.
Yeah, I found Mount Remus. I'm ready to get out of this mess.
But I think a lot of the frustrations Dark Forces has are just the byproduct of it being as old as it is. And most of that stuff can be overlooked just based on the amount of fan service and references to the films. Because while Dark Forces might not be the best first-person shooter ever made, it is easily one of the best Star Wars games ever made. And seeing popular characters like Vader, your mum, and even Mon Mothma showing up and featuring heavily in cinematics just adds a really nice amount of authenticity and appeal.
Interesting.
I mean, there's a reason why they keep bringing Vader back in every single Star Wars related TV show, video game, and comic book. And those brief moments when the member berries show up is really what makes the whole thing still worth playing.
Member edits? Member?
Considering otherwise, there's really not that much content to get through. The base game itself won't take you any longer than 5 or 6 hours to beat, and a single playthrough is going to unlock every single achievement, leaving little reason to ever go back. There's no kind of co-op mode either, or deathmatch, or any of that kind of thing, which to be fair, wasn't in the base game either, so just know that this is not the kind of game you're going to be spending any serious time with. And even going back through the missions to find all the secret areas isn't really going to earn you anything other than a firm pat on the back from yourself. So overall, I'd say that Dark Forces is kind of similar to what Night Dive did recently with Turok 3. That being, it's a great remaster for an okay game.
Don't hang around, let's get out of here before any more troopers arrive.
Is Dark Forces as earth-shattering as some of the other titles they've worked on? Well, no it isn't, but it definitely takes an almost 30-year-old game and makes it infinitely more accessible. And because of that, there's not really anything all that major to complain about. Any of those serious complaints or criticisms I could come up with would be aimed at the original more than the remaster itself. So if I did that, it'd just make me look like a complete dickhead.
Loser! Yes!
It's a matter of acknowledging the game's impact and influence, but also accepting its shortcomings, which, yeah, are going to be noticeable all these years later. It's like going back and replaying Wolfenstein 3D, right? I mean, no one's going to pretend it's aged like a fine wine, but then on the other hand, no one's dumb enough to pretend that it's still not one of the most influential games ever made.
Yeah!
I guess my point is that just know what you're getting yourself into. That being, you're paying money for a better looking and running version of a 29-year-old game. But a great looking 29-year-old game is still a 29-year-old game. Savvy?
Very perceptive, Commander.
At the end of the day, the most exciting thing about this remaster though is that it paves the way for potential updates for Jedi Knight and Jedi Outcast. And that right there is a promising proposition. Because when this series really started to pick up some speed was when they introduced Force powers and lightsabers to the gameplay. And long before Cut Kestis ever showed up on the scene, that shit right there, man, was as good as it got. Also too, like, I want to see Night Dive start remastering stuff that genuinely needs to be remastered. I want to see No One Lives Forever. I want to see Alien Trilogy and Alien Resurrection. And yeah, I want to see motherfucking Blood 2.
That's unexpected!
For now though, at least we can all appreciate the value in shooting stormtroopers in the face with a cannon or sending them into orbit with thermal detonators.